Before I get too far ahead of myself here, if you haven't seen last week's video, which I'll link right up here, pause this video and watch that one first, since this is a continuation of last week's video. And I'll see you back here in a bit. Today I am upgrading the router table I built last week. Hey guys, how's it going? So, you know when you buy a tool and you don't end up needing it for a while? That was kind of the case with this. I was working on a kitchen build commission and I didn't have a reason to use the router table right away. Which was probably a good thing actually, because when I got around to giving it a proper test, I had time to come up with a game plan to address some of the bugs that came up. The first being that I needed a proper fence. Like I mentioned in the previous video, my plan was to use the other side of my table saw fence as the fence for the router table. But after trying to adjust it in the awkward way that was needed, I figured a better option was needed. Probably just as well. I would have also needed to figure out a sacrificial surface for the fence anyway, so whatever. I ran out to my specialty tool store and picked up some aluminum TTrack and cut it to size at the miter saw. Since aluminum is softer than the teeth of my saw blade, I don't have to worry about changing the blade in my saw, I just have to cut a little bit slower. With the TTrack cut to size, I lined them up about an inch away from the router plate, using my speed square to square them up, and marked out the sides with a pencil. Then I threw a 3/4 inch straight bit in my trim router, clamped my speed square to the router table, set the router depth using the TTrack as the depth gauge, and routed out the dados on either side of the router plate. Since the router bit left a rounded end, I squared up the back end with the chisel, and after a couple trips back to the miter saw to finesse the length of the TTrack a little bit. If only there were a device I could have used, you know, it might have like a series of ticks on it, and judging or compared to those ticks you could see how long or short something was. What would something like that be called? With the TTrack cut to the correct length, I dropped it into place, pre-drilled with a self-centering bit, and screwed the TTrack down. Over at the scrap bin, I pull out a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and rip it to size at the table saw. I probably should mention that I am just winging it here. I have no plan to how I'm building this. Anyway, with the pieces ripped to size, I break out the crosscut sled and cut the pieces for the front and bottom of the fence down to final length, and cut a series of right triangles to reinforce and square the fence. Before assembly, I knock off the edges with the trim plane, and then I break out my right angle clamps, dry fit the fence, and then pre-drill, glue, and screw it all together, making sure to keep the screws away from the center of the fence to avoid hitting a router bit with them. Then I repeated the process with the triangles, one on either end and the other two about that far in the middle. You remember I said I'm winging it, right? Since the triangles were a little bit too big, I just flushed everything up with the table saw after making sure I wasn't going to cut through a screw. Now that the fence is assembled and cut to size, I give it a quick once over with the random orbit sander. It's a shop project and this plywood is already fairly smooth, so it probably didn't even need it, but whatever. To drill out the holes for the T-bolts to mount the fence to the table, I placed the fence on the table roughly where it would end up being, marked out the T-track with the pencil, and drilled out the holes. Had I had the right knobs to tighten the fence down to the table, that would have been great, but the T-bolts I picked up were a little bit too long and the knobs were closed on top, so I left it for now. However, it was mounted enough to keep it aligned with the router, more or less anyway. I turned on the router and pulled the fence into the bit. This was on purpose, don't worry. Now over at my workbench, I know exactly where the bit is going to come in contact with the fence, so I can cut out that area for the dust collection port. I tried to take it out with a Forstner bit first, but that didn't really work, so I swapped over to the jigsaw. Didn't work the best around the corner, but it worked well enough. With that done, I ran back to the store and picked up some new knobs, as well as this corner dust collection port, which was the perfect size for this fence. Almost like I planned it, which I certainly didn't. Now that I have the dust port centered, more or less, I pre-drill to prevent cracking and screw the port to the back of the fence. That port just happens to fit the hose for my shop vac, which I'm using hooked up to my dust collector through a 2 to 4 inch adapter, which is probably completely assassinating my airflow, but it works for now. I can upgrade later. And I probably will, eventually. Unfortunately, I didn't pick up a 2 to 2 inch connector, and I didn't want to make yet another trip back to the store for one adapter. However, a shop hack for you, pop cans are the perfect size for 2-inch connectors. I knocked both ends off and cut down the side to allow it to tighten up and clamped the 3 pieces together. Hey, if my grandpa can use a coffee can as a muffler repair, I see no reason why I can't use a pop can as dust collection. With that done, it's time for a test run, which actually went fairly well. With the test run out of the way, I wanted to make one more quick change to the fence. Since I used this ruler to set the bit bearings flush with the front of the fence, I figured it made sense to keep this with the router fence. So I grabbed my jigsaw again, and with a single kerf in 2 of the triangles, I have a handy space to keep this ruler. In hindsight, I would have done these vertically, but this works too. And that was it for a few weeks, until I tested out my raised panel bit, and another design flaw cropped up. Since the router mounting plate was metal, I was hesitant to put the bottom of the router bit all of the way down to avoid bits of flying metal debris of either the router bit or table. What I ended up doing was dropping the bit down to about a 32nd of an inch or so away from the plate, assuming anything thin enough to get between the bit and the table would just get ripped apart. Nope. This just caused the router to jam up and either stall or straight up trip the breaker. So to fix that, I installed the biggest router bit I have, which is this raised panel bit, and by using a screw as a scribe against the side of the bit, I scratched out a diameter around the router bit. Then I pulled the router and adapter off the mounting plate, and this is why I didn't attach the MDF to the 2x4 frame, it just makes this so much easier. With the router removed, I break out my rotary tool with the metal cutoff wheel and start cutting out from the scribe line. I could have used an angle grinder for this, but I figured that the rotary tool would be a little bit more agile for this more detailed work. Then once the center of the mounting plate is removed, I attack the cut edge with grinding stones and files, and then reattach the router. Now I can more or less drop the router bit just below the surface of the table, which works out fairly well. Now the only thing causing my router to stall out is just that it's underpowered. It isn't stalling out because there's stuff jamming it up, so I consider that a win. The dust collection with the panel bit leaves a fair bit to be desired, but I want to revise my dust collection setup again so I can address that at a later date. At this point in time, the commission work I needed the router table for is done. Those videos will come out at some point in the future, and the router table in its current configuration worked like a champ. I'm really happy with how this project worked out. The height adjustment for this is a little bit slow, but that's just because it is the fixed base for the router itself. And I wasn't wanting to spend $400 on a fancy lift system at this time, so yeah. The amount of time I'm actually using a router table, I'm not concerned. I might also try to figure out some router bit storage into this, but that's a project for another day. For the time being, I just put a couple screws into the frame and hung the router bit set off of those for now. So they are right next to the table, but yeah. That's temporary. Though when I say things are temporary, they're usually around for 3 years. That DIY temporary door is still up. You can check that out up here. It's been 3 years. And with that, I'm going to call it a video. Thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to reading them in the comment section below. And if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can follow me on Instagram at JohnTheSchriner. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next video, and have a good one.